Welcome to Duskmourn, where the spooky scaries be spookin'. So you've purchased the Death Toll Precon deck, and you want to make it your own. In this video we will go over the best new cards, the new commanders, the best reprints, and lastly, a selection of cards to swap in to begin the process of upgrading this deck. This deck is green and black and focuses on filling your graveyard, then reanimating your creatures. We are very much at home in the realm of Reanimator, something that is easily accomplished in our colors. Our deck's main commander is Winter Cynical Opportunist, a 4-mana 2/5 human warlock with Death Touch. Whenever Winter attacks, you mill 3 cards. They also have Delirium, where at the beginning of your end step, you may exile any number of cards from your graveyard with 4 or more card types among them. If you do, you put a permanent from among them onto the battlefield with a finality counter on it. Delirium is a returning mechanic that cares about graveyard composition. Delirium abilities are live as long as you have 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. Permanents with finality counters on them are exiled when they die or are destroyed. Winter is very much in line with the traditional Reanimator strategy, but he feeds into the engine more so than some other commanders do. The attack trigger that mills 3 will hopefully expedite us getting those 4 card types into our graveyard, as much of the rest of this deck cares about the types of cards in the bin. This commander wants to be in play, actively swinging at opponents to send our deck to the graveyard. Once we get our cards into the bin, our end step will give us the ability to exile cards from the graveyard and put one into play for free, on the condition that once the card would be destroyed and sent to the graveyard, it returns to exile. Our backup commander is Rendmaw Creaky Nest. This 5-mana 5/5 has both Menace and Reach. Whenever Rendmaw attacks, and whenever you play a card with 2 or more card types, each player creates a tapped 2/2 black bird creature token with flying. Those tokens are then goaded for the remainder of the game. Goaded creatures can't attack you, and they must attack each combat if able. This is rather unique for a commander, as we are not only looking to build into cards that have multiple card types, such as artifact creatures or enchantment artifacts, but we are giving out goaded tokens for doing so. These can help us whittle down our opponents, as their flock of crows will grow and pick at each other until we can come in for the kill. These two abilities don't have a lot of obvious synergy to them, but there are plenty of cards with the dual typing that can be utilized for value. Our third commander is Old Stickfingers, a 2-drop horror with an X cost. When you cast Old Stickfingers, you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X creature cards. All creature cards that were revealed this way are put into the graveyard, and then the rest are put onto the bottom of your library in a random order. Old Stickfinger's power and toughness are each equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So we have a pretty powerful mill ability that will really only hit our creatures. A lot of times in mill decks, you'll hit cards that you maybe don't want to mill. With Old Stickfingers, you do have a little bit of control as to what's actually hitting the graveyard. Only your creatures will be binned, and so if you have any enchantments or sorceries, particularly your reanimation spells, those are spared and returned to the library for later use. You will want to spend at least 1 mana on the X cost for Old Stickfingers when casting, since his toughness will be 0 upon hitting the battlefield if you have no creature cards in your graveyard. Now let's take a look at some of the new cards seeing their first printing in this deck. I want to look at cards that will either work well within the strategy this deck utilizes, or cards that are generically powerful in the context of the commander format. Convert to Slime is a 5-mana sorcery. It destroys up to 1 each of a target artifact, creature, and enchantment. Should you have 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, you then create an XX green ooze creature token, where X is the total mana value of all the permanents that were destroyed this way. This is very reminiscent of Decimate, a spell in red-green that does about the same thing, although with Convert to Slime, we could possibly get us an ooze creature token out of it. Since it is the combined mana value of the destroyed cards, that token can become very large. This can be a very big swing in value with you, clearing out the biggest permanents that are in play to get yourself a blob of a creature. Deluge of Doom is 3 mana for a sorcery. All creatures get -X until the end of turn, where X is the number of card types among the cards in your graveyard. This is based obviously on Toxic Deluge, which gives a debuff based on the life that you pay as an additional cost. This debuff's based on the number of card types that are in your graveyard, and since our deck is all about min-maxing card types in the bin, this should be a solid wrath effect. Demolisher Spawn is a 7-mana 7/7 with Trample and Haste. Whenever the spawn attacks, if you have 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, other attacking creatures get +4/+4 until the end of turn. This is pretty much our on-theme Craterhoof effect. We are looking to fill our bin with card types, and then reanimate cards. A lot of what reanimator decks, and this deck specifically aim for, is getting big creatures out without paying their mana costs. By cheating these mana costs, then swinging out, you could potentially win games out of nowhere, and this giving a pretty hefty buff can quickly end games. Formless Genesis is 3 mana for a kindred sorcery with Shapeshifter. It also has Changeling, making it every creature type. You create an XX colorless Shapeshifter creature token with Changeling and Death Touch, where X is the number of land cards in your graveyard. It also has Retrace, which lets you recast this card from your graveyard by discarding a land card in addition to paying its other costs. I think this might be one of the strongest new cards in this deck. Firstly, this card works wonders for our deck's theme of card types, since both Kindred and Sorcery give us a card type count of 2. Kindred spells are, at the moment, rather uncommon, although it is replacing the prior phrasing of Tribal. This gives us giant creature tokens, the more lands that we've milled. We also get to recast this from the graveyard, allowing us to get multiple Shapeshifter tokens and more lands in grave. Since those tokens also have Changeling and therefore are every creature type, this can, in theory, slot into several Kindred decks that focus on creature types. I also like this for decks that are wishing to sacrifice their own lands, such as Titania or Lord Windgrace. Into the Pit is a 3 mana enchantment. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may also cast spells from the top of your library by sacrificing a non-land permanent in addition to paying their other costs. This reminds me of Bolas's Citadel, although it's a lot more themed to our reanimator strategy and for half the mana. You'll be able to rifle through your library much quicker with this and utilize any kind of spell. Even instants and sorceries are at your disposal, and them being a known quantity only to you can give you the element of surprise. Now, these are what I consider to be the best new cards of the deck, but we've gotten dozens of reprints worth mention. Arachnogenesis is a fantastic fog effect, and it can give you a huge army of spider tokens. While this deck doesn't really care much for token cards specifically, these can help make you blockers, that way you can save your creatures for their value without fear of them dying in combat. Cemetery Tampering is a personal favorite from my Mimeoplasm deck, letting you dig 5 cards deep to exile a card face down. Then, during your upkeep, you get a mill trigger, and once you have 20 or more cards in the bin, you get to play the exiled card for free. Culling Ritual is such a slept-on board wipe. Since it's only hitting non-land permanents with mana value of 2 or less, this kills off a lot of relevant mana rocks, Soul Ring, tokens, and then after that, you get a very hefty chunk of both black and green mana. This can be a great way to trade in some cards that you no longer need on the battlefield to play a higher costed spell. Dryad Arbor is perhaps the only land I would have suggested to add to this deck had it not already been included. Dryad Arbor is a land creature, giving you both types for the sake of Delirium, and while it still has Summoning Sickness, you are effectively getting a free creature with quite a bit of upside with it being a land. An underrated aspect of this card is that it's insulated against non-land permanent removal. Grist the Hungertide is one of 4 Planeswalker cards included in this deck. You do have to include a few to be more confident about getting Delirium live. Grist's +1 ability creates us a 1/1 black and green insect token, and then you mill a card. If an insect card is milled this way, you put a loyalty counter on Grist and repeat this process. This deck has quite a few insects in it, namely Hornet Queen, the Carrion Grub, Giant Ataphage, and Haywire Mite, so there are a few potential targets to get us an additional mill off of this ability. We also have Creature and Planeswalker removal on the -2. Lastly, the -5 ability burns each opponent for the number of creature cards in your graveyard. The base deck has 26 creatures, not counting Winter, and so this could translate easily into a win condition. Noxious Gearhulk is a solid piece of removal, letting you destroy a creature and gain life equal to that creature's toughness. It also has both artifact and creature subtypes, so you'll have that relevance for the Delirium. Professor Onyx is a very powerful planeswalker with Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, each opponent loses 2 life, and then you gain 2 life. You can also +1 her to lose 1 life, and then look at the top 3 cards of your library. You put one of those into your hand and bin the rest. You can -3 her to have each opponent sacrifice their largest creature. Lastly, you can -8 her to have each opponent discard a card. If they don't, they lose 3 life. This process then repeats 6 additional times. This can convert into a win condition, as this at max can drain 21 life. I love Professor Onyx, she's one of my favorite Oathbreaker decks. I put together a competitive list for her a while back, pairing her with Chain of Smog. You can take a look in the description of this video for a link to that one. Chain of Smog is a 2-mana sorcery that makes a target player discard a card. This can be you. That player who was targeted can then choose to copy the Chain of Smog, and then choose a new target for the copy, which still can be you. If you choose yourself repeatedly, you can infinitely discard your hand and infinitely copy the spell, even if you've run out of cards in hand. Since Professor Onyx has Magecraft, each time that you've copied this spell, you drain the table for 2 life and gain 2 life. This is a very easily accomplished win condition, and while you don't have to include it in this deck, it is an option. Reanimate is a powerful reanimation spell, quite literally granting its namesake to the deck type. We do lose life from this ability, but I do think it's worth it to drop huge threats from our bin. In a deck like this, your opponents aren't really safe from your biggest creatures, even if they're in the grave. Stitcher Supplier is another favorite of mine. Whenever it enters or dies, you mill 3. This can get plenty of juicy cards in the bin to help feed the Delirium. Whip of Erebos is a 4-mana enchantment artifact. 2 card types. Creatures you control have lifelink, and for 4 mana you can return a target card from your graveyard to the battlefield and it gains haste. Exile it at the beginning of the next end step, but if it leaves the battlefield before then, it is exiled instead of putting it anywhere else. You're only able to activate this ability as a sorcery, another classic reanimation target, and of course this does carry 2 card types. Wrenn 7 is another walker in this deck, this one being more the ramp engine. You can +1 to dig 4 deep into your library, keep all the lands, then bin the rest. Wrenn's 0 ability lets you put any number of lands from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. You can also -3 to create a Treefolk whose power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. Finally, you can -8 Wrenn to return all permanents from your graveyard to your hand, and then you get an emblem giving you no maximum hand size. This has just a lot of solid value abilities on it. Now for our last section, we are going to discuss 10 cards to add in to help refine the build and hone in on the strategies set forth by our main commander. Winter wants more card types milled to the graveyard and give us juicy reanimation targets. We're going to add in some cards for both. For this set, we're going to impose a $25 budget for upgrades. Starting off, Doom Whisperer is a large creature with evasion, but more importantly, we have the ability to pay 2 life to surveil 2. This lets us look at the top 2 cards from our library, put any number of them into the graveyard, and then the rest go to the top of our library in any order. This is great to help manipulate the top card of our library, and better, we can bin more cards to help speed up the Delirium going live. Head Shredder is a vehicle that mills us 2 when it attacks. If we mill lands, those are then put into play tapped. This can literally be crewed by any creature, since it's a crew of 1, and it helps fill our graveyard. Living Death is a classic win condition for Reanimator strategies and can give us another route to victory. If we run out of creatures to bury, we can simply reanimate everything and force opponents to lose their creatures. Osseous Stick Twister is a 2/2 artifact creature with lifelink for 2. It also has Delirium, which at the beginning of your end step, if Delirium is live, each opponent may sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card. Then, the Stick Twister deals damage equal to its power to each opponent who didn't sacrifice a permanent or discard a card this way. Because it has lifelink, this will also gain us 2 life for each opponent that it damages. This card synergizes so nicely with this deck, giving us a great payoff for having Delirium live that also forces opponent to give up card advantage or take damage. Oversouled Cemetery is one of my favorites in Reanimator strategies, giving us a means to recur creatures from the graveyard without any additional cost. It does require, however, us having 4 or more creatures in the graveyard to resolve, but it's still a solid engine. Ripples of Undeath is more mill support, letting us mill 3, and then we can return 1 card we milled with this ability for 1 mana and a paying of 3 life. Shigeki Jukai Visionary is an enchantment creature, so we get more of that dual typing. It does have some good applications here though. You can return it to its owner's hand to look 4 deep in your library, snag a land to your hand, and then bin the rest. You can also pay double X and 2 green and discard Shigeki to return X target non-legendary cards from your graveyard to your hand. Delirium doesn't really care about legendary as a super type so much as card types, and so we do have additional recursion that doesn't really impact our deck negatively. This can just get us back any card we want in our graveyard, permanent or non-permanent. Twitching Doll is an adorable mana dork for 2 mana and is an artifact creature. Yay, dual typing. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color and then put a nest counter on the doll. You can tap and sacrifice the doll to create 2/2 spider tokens with reach for each counter on the Twitching Doll, but you can only do this at sorcery speed. Yikes, that is nightmare fuel, but it's powerful. We can use this in the early game to get mana and build up counters, and then sacrifice it to make us an army of spiders. Wickerfolk Thresher is another artifact creature, but this one is a 5/4 for 4 mana, so good stat line. It has Delirium on an attack trigger. If it attacks and Delirium is live, you can look at the top card of your library. If it's a land, put it onto the battlefield. It doesn't have to come in tapped. If you don't put that card onto the battlefield, you put it into your hand. So, card advantage, potential ramp that doesn't require the land enter tapped, and a sizable body, this card is an absolute piece of value for this deck. Lastly, White of the Reliquary can grow larger the more creature cards are in your graveyard, and we can sacrifice another creature to tutor for any land card to come into the battlefield. This helps put bodies in the bin and gives us the lands we need. Now, since we're adding in 10 cards, we do have to remove 10 cards to maintain that 100 card deck size. Normally, I'll suggest 10 cards from this deck to remove and put them on screen. However, I've realized that the cards that I choose to cut may change over time, and so my choices may change in the coming weeks and some of these cards might make their way back in. So instead, I'm going to post a comment in the coming days with the 10 cards that I personally choose to remove, and should those choices change over time, I will update that comment accordingly. I generally recommend removing cards that aren't really your playstyle first, and then remove the more costly cards that have too high of a mana value to regularly see play. Everyone's playstyle is different, of course, and so your choices may be different from mine. I have to say, I'm not surprised this set brought a reanimator strategy to the table, but I am very happy to see Winter. This is a solid strategy that is tried and true, and while there are a number of different approaches to this deck, the Delirium subtheme makes for a very unique, flavorful take that forces you to play certain kinds of cards. But for now, that will bring us to the end of our look at the Death Toll Precon. What cards do you tech into your list? Let's discuss them down below if you dare. If you enjoyed this video, likes and shares are always appreciated. If you're new here, subscribe to never miss a new video. I do appreciate your time spent with me here today. As always, my name is Flynn, and I'll catch you all next video.